for our state and for our world, and really just hoping that those fires can get under control, and that in general that we can take care of our planet as much as possible. So, okay, with that, hello, thank you again for joining me. We're going to get started. A reminder for everyone, Zoom protocol, you have down there the chat, the raising of the virtual hand, the Q&A options. So as we go through, feel free to start commenting, and then when we get to the time where it's our opportunity to share our thoughts together, please, of course, raise your virtual hand so I can call on you and we can share thoughts together. So let's begin with the blessing for engaging in the study of Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kirishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Praised are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who commands us to engage in the study of Torah. Amen. All right, we are in our 25th session, and just a heads up that most likely there are only a few more sessions left of this class. Doesn't mean that I'm going to stop teaching altogether, but as we're getting into the fall, we're starting conversations about the types of adult education that we're going to be offering. And so there's going to be some shifts in terms of who's teaching and what we're teaching and when we're teaching. So feel free to shoot me an email. All the source sheets that are sent out have my email on them. So feel free to shoot me an email if you have any ideas of certain things that you think we should be offering in terms of either subject matter, style of learning, and so that we can start thinking about what we're going to be offering in the fall after the holidays. So today, a famous story that looks at really through the frame of this idea of the crowns on the letters of the Torah. And I just want to show you a picture of that so you know exactly what I'm referring to. Right? If you look at this picture, you will see that on certain letters, there are these little crowns at the very top, right? These little things that are called tagim in Hebrew, or the little crowns, as they're also known, really ways of accentuating the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. And I'm not an expert in these, but supposedly that's one of the ways you can tell when a Torah was written and who wrote it, and the style in which it was written based on those crowns and the various ways in which a different sofer will elaborate the letters. Right, and these are the only elaborations allowed in the Torah. So there's no other, of course, artistic renditions found in the Torah itself. So this is really the only way in which a sofer expresses. In this case, mostly there's only one soferet from what I understand out there, but the way in which the sofer can express himself through these crowns. So that's the framework for this story. But the story is really about fate versus free will. It's about legacy, and it's about the limitations of really understanding what's going on in the universe around us. So let's just dig in and see what we find from this week's story. Okay. So we're in Menachot, the same section actually we were in last week when we studied last week's session. And then 2 weeks ago, we studied Rabbi Akiva's story as well. And that time we studied Rabbi Akiva when his wife first meets him and he goes off and he studies for long periods of time. So if you remember that a few weeks back. So here we're going to hear a story that incorporates Moses and Rabbi Akiva, all under auspices of God and God's relationship to them. Okay, so here we go. We'll read through it and then we'll go back and we'll break it down a little. Said Rabbi Yehuda, said Rav, at the time that Moses went up on high to the heavens, he found the Holy One sitting, affixing crowns to the letters of the Torah. He said to him, Lord of the universe, who is stopping you from regarding the document as perfect without these additional crowns on the letters? God said to him, there is a man who is going to arrive at the end of many generations, and Akiva ben Yosef is his name, who is going to interpret on the basis of each point of the crowns heaps and heaps of laws. He said to him, Master of the universe, show him to me. God said to him, turn around. Moses turned around and took his seat at the end of the 8th row of Rabbi Akiva's academy, but he could not grasp what the people were saying. He felt faint. But when the discourse reached a certain matter and the disciple said, Rabbi, how do you know this? And he answered, "It is a law given to Moses from Sinai." He regained his composure. He went and came before the Holy One. He said before him, "Master of the universe, how come you have someone like that, and yet you give the Torah through me?" He said to him, "Silence. That is how the thought came to me." He said to him, "Master of the universe, you have shown me his Torah. Now show me his reward." He said to him, "Turn around." He turned around and saw Rabbi Akiva's flesh being weighed out at the butcher stalls in the market. He said to him, "Master of the universe, this is Torah and this is its reward?" He said to him, "Silence. That is how the thought came to me." An end of story. Okay? So we have God, we have Moses, and we have Rabbi Akiva. And it's almost like a time travel, right? You can imagine if this was a scene that Moses goes up onto a mountain. He's speaking with God. God is affixing the letters to the tops of all the letters in the Hebrew in the Torah, and then God takes him on this journey first to Rabbi Akiva's Beit Midrash, and then later to see what ends up happening to Rabbi Akiva. So we have this time travel going on, and really I want you to be thinking about what's the message that the rabbis are trying to teach us here, and what are we learning about Moses? Is Moses supposed to represent us, each one of us? Are we supposed to imagine ourselves as Rabbi Akiva? God willing, not with the same kind of end that Rabbi Akiva experiences, but what's supposed to be our role in this story itself, considering we are not Moses and we are not Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva, of course, being the one who is given credit for coming up with the concept of Pardes, and Pardes is an acronym for the 4 ways in which we are supposed to interpret Torah, the 4 levels: Pshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod. Right? And that these are the 4 ways in which when you study Torah, whether it's the 5 books of Moses or even potentially Talmud, that you are supposed to understand that there are various levels of interpretation that occur. And so Rabbi Akiva is given credit for coming up with that concept. And also he is really credited with helping to make oral Torah significant in our tradition and really allowing, as God says in the story itself, he heaps laws and laws upon all the little details of the Torah itself. Right. And so already we have something before we even get into the story. As soon as we see this idea that there's going to be someone who even can find interpretation and significance in each of the little frills that we find at the top of all the Hebrew letters, that has, if you think about how we study Torah today, has consumed the way we are supposed to understand Torah, that nothing is irrelevant or insignificant in the Torah. Every word has significance, that we should be spending our time interpreting every single word and every story to the greatest level that we can. And for me, that's one of the most beautiful things about Torah, is that there is so much room to interpret and to continue to interpret. And that freedom stems traditionally from Rabbi Akiva. Okay, so let's go back. We'll read it one more time, and then I'll open it up to all of you to share your thoughts. Okay. So Rabbi Judah said, Rav, at the time that Moses went up on high to the heavens, he found the Holy One sitting, affixing crowns to the letters of the Torah. Already a really interesting thing that we see, that when Moses goes up, God is sitting there and doing this work. And why would God be spending God's time doing that when God could be doing all kinds of other things? So already this story is putting God in this place of worrying about the details, that God is not only worried about the big picture, but is worried about the minutia, and that even the minutia have significance. And I think if we were to take that to our own lives, we're not supposed to only focus on the big ideas or the big events. We are also supposed to find significance in the little moments in our life. And that's why every single day we wake up and we share a whole set of blessings about the daily miracles, that we are supposed to find that miraculous sense of being alive, in everything from opening our eyes to putting on our clothes, etc. Okay, so even God here is basically modeling for us that is something that's very important in our tradition. So Moses says to him, God, Why are you doing this? And who's stopping you? Why do you need to add these things? Aren't the letters enough? Weren't they just perfect the way they were without adding these little artistic elements to each of these Hebrew letters? And God says, well, in other words, I'm doing it because there's going to be a man who's going to come a long time from now, if we're going to time travel. His name's Rabbi Akiva, and he's going to interpret based on each point of the crown's heaps and heaps of laws, right? In other words, it's not just specifically that he's going to make interpretations on these little artistic things that are happening on each of the letters, but that he is going to find significance, as I just said, in all the details that we find in our tradition. And so God says, and Moses says, well, show this man to me. I mean, you can imagine that Moses has been at the center of the relationship between him and God and has had this intimacy. And now he's being told that actually there's someone who's going to come and is going to take what Moses has created in partnership with God and is going to expand that exponentially. So we can't tell, is Moses wanting to find this out because he's jealous? Is it because he's just purely interested in who could be this person who is going to add so much to what he already created? We don't really know. And we don't really ever know in the story, I don't think. And God says, turn around. So all of a sudden, Moses turns around, and you can imagine the movie all of a sudden, especially with special effects these days, all of a sudden he is in a different scene. And what's the scene? He's at the end of the row, of the 8th row in Rabbi Akiva's Beit Midrash. So he's learning. Rabbi Akiva is standing up there teaching all the students in front of everyone. And there is Moses. Now, where Moses is sitting is significant because traditionally the best students were sitting in the front and the worst students were sitting in the back. And so we're supposed to imagine that Moses is actually at the very back of the Beit Midrash in the last seat in the 8th row, in other words, as it just says, but he could not grasp what the people were saying. It's as if the tradition that he helped to create is no longer accessible to him. He doesn't even know what they're talking about. It's like a whole different religion, which it is, if you think about it. And we could draw even some significance from the fact that it's the 8th row. First, on the 8th day, there is a bris, a brit milah, the covenant that happens for boys. But also, if you think about 8, there's also the idea that the number 8 has to do with the fulfillment of creation. It's the first day that happens after creation has occurred. The first 7 days, God resting on the 7th day. But then the 8th day is the start of something brand new. So here he is, he's at the end of the 8th row. He has no idea what's going on. It's like a foreign language to him. And he feels faint. Now we can imagine he's probably feeling faint because he's completely out of his environment. I mean, imagine if all of a sudden we were to turn around and be in a completely different time period, completely different language from what we even understand. And he has been told that this is a man who is going to be building off of what he created. So you could imagine it's understandable that he would feel completely out of whack. But when the discourse reached a certain matter, in other words, they're talking and they're teaching, Akiva's teaching about something, and the students say to him, well, how do you know this? Rabbi Akiva is talking about something and they want proof as to why does Rabbi Akiva take this perspective. Rabbi Akiva answers and says, well, it's a law that was given to Moses at Mount Sinai. And that puts Moses at ease. So for some reason, as soon as he hears his name, as soon as he hears that he is actually still a part of this tradition, and that this is, as God had already told him, that this is a continuation of what he started and what he's been a part of, that puts him at ease, right? Because Akiva puts what he is doing now in the context of something much bigger and places Moses at the start of that. So Moses now realizes that he is not cut out of that tradition, but he is still a part of it. So he goes back. Now Moses, poof, is now back before God. And he says to him, well, God, you had someone like that, someone who I don't even understand what he's saying. It's so complicated and complex and sophisticated, and there's so many followers. You gave Torah through me when you have someone like that? So now we're getting a little bit of Moses' humility, maybe. And also, why me? the question, why me? Why am I chosen? Sometimes it's we say why me from the place of having suffered, and sometimes from a place of leadership, why me? Why did you choose me? And if we remember Moses' story, he didn't want to be chosen in the beginning, in the first place. So here we still have that trope. And God says, silence. That is how the thought came to me. Don't ask me, says God, why I gave the Torah through you and not through Akiva. That's just the way it is. I made the decision. No more discussion about it. But Moses doesn't stop there. He says, God, you have shown me his Torah. You've shown me what he's able to teach and what he's done with this Torah. Now show me his reward. And God again says, turn around. And again, with CGI, and we imagine he turns around, and now he's in the marketplace where Rabbi Akiva's flesh is being weighed out at the butcher stalls in the market, because traditionally Rabbi Akiva was martyred as part of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. And so here is this famous rabbi who transformed Judaism. And how is he rewarded? He's rewarded by being martyred, and this disgusting, terrible image of literally his flesh being weighed out at the market. And so Moses says to him, Master of the universe, this is Torah and this is its reward. This is what happens to someone who is given Torah and brought it to the next level. And God says, silence. That is how the thought came to me. And that is the end of the story. And again, it's the same response from God that Moses got a little while ago about why Moses was chosen to give the Torah to the people and not Rabbi Akiva. Okay, so we have a few themes here, I think. One is this idea of legacy. What is your legacy? How does Moses understand his place in a broad history? And the fact that he, in some ways, is hopeful that he can continue to be a part of that history, because when he goes and he sits in the back of Rabbi Akiva's Beit Midrash, it's almost as if he feels irrelevant. But then as soon as his name is mentioned, he realizes, no, okay, I'm still a part of this. I don't have to feel like all my work was for naught. And then we also have the fact that Rabbi Akiva's legacy is both one of great Torah scholarship, and yet his ending is that of a martyr, which in our tradition it's seen as, in his case, something that was really important, that he stood up for his tradition and for Judaism. But so we have the legacy, and then we have this idea that of God's answer to Moses' questions, which is silence. That's just the way it is. Don't ask me anymore. And so where does free will come into this versus fate? It seems to be that this story seems to be suggesting that God has figured it all out and that's just the way it is. But maybe not. Maybe it's just, this is the rabbi suggesting there are limits to what we should be asking, and there are limits to what we can understand. And we are never going to understand the fact that the rewards that we may give to the world, or the gifts that we may give to the world, we may not necessarily be repaid at the end of our life in the way that we feel we deserve or that we should deserve, that there are endings and our beginnings and our lives may not go in the trajectory that would seem to fit a pattern, or that based on what we create in the world, that our lives are going to end in a way that honors that, which is very disturbing for us to think about, right? We don't want to think about all the hard work that we've done in our life could end in an instant, or end in such a terrible way as Rabbi Akiva. Part of the reason I chose this story now is because we're about to hit the high holidays, and the Unatana Tokef prayer is going to remind us who will live and who will die. We don't know if we're going to make it through this next year. There were, of course, we think about it, thousands upon thousands of people who last year at this time would have thought they would have had many more years to live, and yet, because of COVID-19, are no longer here. So there seems to be something built into this story that if you are trying to figure out the pattern or the calculations to figure out how this world works, it's just not even worth going there. Silence. That is the way I thought it into being, and that is the way it is. Which doesn't necessarily mean that God is suggesting that God forced that hand, but that is just the way it ends up. I think that is mostly what I wanted to leave us with before I really wanted to open it up to all of you and hear your thoughts about what you think about this story. Is this an optimistic story? Is this a depressing story? Where are we supposed to go with this? Okay, let's start with E. Seidlin. Sorry, E. Seidlin, it doesn't say your first name, so I'm gonna leave it to you to introduce yourself, and please feel free to start talking. No? Okay. We'll come back to you. Go ahead, Jeff.
There's a little reference medical fact which plays into the story that God created everything through the use of words. When you are in thought, what's actually happening in your larynx is that your vocal cords are actually vibrating. And it's sub-audible speech, which is actually what thought represents. And here is God, whose words create everything. And though his thoughts may not have been what looks appropriate to Moses, the thoughts in and of themselves, the sub-audible speech, literally creates the scenario, and God attributes that to thought. So that, again, the process is that God's words, spoken or even sub-audible, are the basis of all forms of creation. And hopefully the story gives us all some thought about what our words can create.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for that teaching. I appreciate it. Hi, Steve.
Shana Tova. While you were teaching us this lesson, it reminded me of a midrash about Moses and Joshua, where Moses cuts a deal with God to live and becomes a disciple of Joshua. And Joshua is teaching, and Moses is in the back of the room kind of covering his face so he isn't recognized, but he is recognized. And the people ask him to explain a teaching of Joshua, and Moses can't. He's stumbling and failing to explain Joshua's teaching. And so he says to God, I can't ask to continue to live in this scenario, and so he agrees to die. And it's interesting in the parallelism with this story of Akiva.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. Yes, and I don't know if you want to give your thoughts on what you think the teaching is behind that. I'll give you that opportunity if you want to. But for me, one of the things that stands out to me about both of those stories is that we have a certain role to play, and we have responsibilities, as Jeff also pointed out, with the words we use, but also what we teach with our actions and what we do with our lives. And down the road, we are here for a specific time period to fulfill a specific need. We may not know what that need is. I think it's a lifelong journey to try and figure out what our goal is in being here and how we're supposed to add more meaning and hope to the world. But we may not know what that is. And we are here at a specific time for a specific reason. And what exists now is not going to exist down the road. And so we can't even try to imagine what it would be like for us to live in a different time, right? It's fun to just kind of fantasize about what if I lived in the medieval times or in the future. But really, I think one of the important lessons that this story is teaching is focus on how you can maximize what you are doing now in the world and what your teaching is to the world. Because it may not feel relevant down the road, or if you were to be a part of it, it may look different. It may not seem the same. And yet, it is probably still built in some way, or possibly built upon what you did in your time, in your way, with your words and your actions. And so while we could get caught up in trying to focus too much about what's going to happen in the future. I think the story is trying to remind us, focus on now, because it's gonna, if you were to focus too much on what your legacy is going to look like, you're gonna get caught up in the wrong game, because you're never gonna be able to figure that out, because the world's gonna look different. We already know that based on the last year. All of us who are on this call know that the world is clearly different than when we were born, and so we have to really try and maximize what we are doing now, so that our legacy, no matter how it will look in the future, we have to create the building blocks now. So that's one of the things that I take away from that. So thank you, Steve. Hi, Merle.
Hi. So, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so I'm thinking, go back to where you said, is it optimistic or depressing? In my years of Jewish communal service for 40 years and taking a break and now back involved in it again in a different way, in teaching volunteer management and being a volunteer coordinator and trying to help boards and congregations, mostly synagogues, but also some churches here in town, that I look at it from the optimistic view that what you said about maximize what you're doing. We can go out there and whatever our profession is, we can maximize what we think is the best thing for the people that we're teaching or working with. What the depressing part is especially now during the pandemic, when there's things that we can all be doing, and I see people's really frightening attitudes about how bad everything is and their life is horrible. And that part is, there's still things that can be done from home or from whatever we can do. And the depressing part is that people who used to be very active are taking on a very, I don't want to say poor attitude, but very negative attitude towards what their lives have become because of this. And they're not willing to make an effort to do whatever they can do from wherever they are. That's my take on optimism and depression.
Great. Thank you, Merle. Yeah, it's a tough time. And I think, just as I was realizing earlier this week, and my wife pointed out to me the fact that on Friday it's going to be 6 months, that weighs on people in different ways, right? And for some, the opportunity is, and we've studied isolation and the cave mentality in previous classes, there are moments when you can be in that isolation and it can drive you to want to leave the cave. And there are other ways in which that darkness that comes with being in the cave and in isolation can overcome you and be overwhelming. And when we are in that isolation, if we're not having the type of support system that can help us to see the light and to look towards what we can still create within our cave, in the hopes that we can eventually leave our isolation and maximize as much as we can our potential. If you don't have that support system around you, it's very difficult to continue to be motivated. And that's, of course, why community is important. And that's why, of course, healthy relationships and friendships and partnerships are so vital at times like these, because if you don't have those kinds of things, it's doubly hard to try and motivate yourself in these situations. And you're right. And I think the longer we're in this, there is going to be more and more people who kind of fall into the darkness of the isolation. And so the work for those of us who can sustain the energy and maybe find even more energy as we go through this, have an even greater responsibility, which can also feel overwhelming, right? Because it takes a lot of energy just to sustain and get through it. And if you are one who then is hopeful and really wants to bring that energy to other people, now you have to add another layer on top of what it takes just to stay at baseline. So I think one of the things that I'm thinking about as we enter into the new year, and I definitely want to create a ritual for myself next week before we get into Rosh Hashanah, is how can I do something that helps me feel like in this next year I want to emerge even more from this cave of isolation, and not just, of course, physically going out, but how can I spiritually and emotionally prepare myself for a year that is going to be tumultuous, who knows, it could be even more tumultuous than this, because once we do emerge, whatever that may look like, it's going to be a scramble, and we're going to all be confused, and we're going to all be dealing with a whole bunch of different emotions. So I think this was, in a way, the calm period before a different type of storm that is going to be coming in this new Jewish year. And we have a responsibility to be preparing ourselves and also trying to surround ourselves now with the people who can care for us and motivate us in the right ways as we enter into this new year. Thank you. Any other thoughts? Jeff, I don't know if your hand was up from the first time or not, so I don't know if you had something additional to add.
I was just going to add one thought again about thoughts and words, especially in this coming time of the high holidays and all of the words that must be said. When you're sitting in shul, your mind can wander, you can have a flight of ideas, you can have non-attention. Yet when it comes to the connection between saying the words, that requires focused attention from your mind to create the words and say the words. And that, I think, is the whole purpose of how the liturgy for all of the prayers of teshuvah, forgiveness, and review are required to be said out loud, because in essence, the words focus the mind and the mind focuses the words to make sense out of the commitment to change, a commitment towards righteousness. It requires the focus of both mind and words and action that comes secondary to that.
Great, thank you. Yes, and you remind me that I think we're all going to be watching high holidays from our own homes, where there's also not an accountability necessarily to be verbal. During a prayer service, there is either an overt or a covert kind of peer pressure to engage in the service in some way. Even if you don't want to stand up and everyone else is standing up, you stand up, right? There is this communal accountability that comes with just physically being with other people. When we're at home, it's going to be very easy for everyone to just sit and watch the service not as a participant, but just to passively experience it. And so I'd urge all of you who are on this right now to verbalize some of those prayers out loud, or to stand up when we get to the Baruch Hu. Figure out ways where you, even if we're not all going to be together, can there be ways in which you can still be a part of that and verbalize that? Because I think that's going to be one of the challenges. I think there are going to be a lot of people who walk away from these services and saying, well, it looked nice, but obviously I didn't feel like I was participating in it, and I was just passively watching. And yes, we are passively watching, but I still think, and it's going to be even more incumbent upon us, which I think is a great lesson for this year, especially with the high holidays, it's going to be incumbent upon us to actively engage. And no one's telling us what to do, right? So we have to be self-motivated. And I think that is a significant theme that we need to have right now for our lives, is to have that self-motivation. So I urge you to figure out ways in which you can do that and engage in the high holiday experience where you feel as though you're an active participant and not just passively observing. Okay, Susan. Hi, Susan.
I have one big question, and then I have some other things to say. So to the end of the pandemic, it's going to be all heck's going to be loosened. I would hope that we would learn from it. And we certainly, temples and Jewish communities are learning to use this wonderful technology we have to really bring learning to people, communities to people, without being one-on-one. My schedule has never been so full and so wonderfully full. And maybe there's some lessons here. Have we learned to be more introspective, less frenetic, less pushed and driven, literally and metaphorically, and then to appreciate, like the crowns in the Torah, the little things that we have. We've talked about this before, but focusing on you're getting able to get up in the morning, and particularly this community that is able to get up in the morning. And most of the people I know are not are not suffering like the people around the larger community, and that we should feel for. And once, I broke some bones in my pelvis and was in a wheelchair for a while. When you come out of it, you become very aware of the gift that you have of mobility, and the thing, and after coming out of the cave here, we should be aware too of the smaller things and appreciate them. So, and the less smog and all of that. And that's what I think we could potentially learn from this.
I agree, Susan.
But I have
Yes.
a big question for you. I've heard the tale before of Moses coming back and not understanding what Akiva was talking about. And that was also a rationale for the reform movement to say, look, at this as a new generation. This is how we're interpreting things and so on. Our ancestors might not follow that. But this last line wasn't there before. And this was disturbing to me. This is Torah and this is its reward. Silent. That's by seeing Rabbi Akiva's flesh being weighed at the butcher's stall. That is, it's so gruesome. And for God just saying silence, that is how the thought came to me. Is that a silence like he tells to Job?
Yeah, I think it is similar. I think it's the idea that we're not going to understand the way all of this works out. And it's not all your reward is not always going to be a reward. It may be a punishment, and we are not necessarily going to see that the benefits of the hard work that we do. It may not. We know this. We know there are too many people who have lost their lives way before they should have, and in crazy circumstances. And we know also, that there are bad people or people who do bad things who still end up being successful, however we would want to define that. And I think this is a message saying don't get caught up too much in that. Don't focus so much on the reward. Focus more on what it is that you are going to offer, because we don't know the reward as we've seen in the world around us doesn't always seem to match the effort that's put into it. And so I think it is disturbing. It's supposed to remind us that, it doesn't always work out exactly the way we want it to. And that Torah, in addition, Torah is disturbing. It is a sweet, beautiful, wonderful thing. But if as many of you already have, studied those stories in the Torah and really dove into the details there are a lot of really messed up things that are taking place in the Torah, and a lot of disturbing stories, and those disturbing stories match the reality of the world. And so this is I think a rabbinic reminder of the reality of the world in which we live, that just, Susan, as you were saying, we need to be hopeful and we need to focus on those small things as we slowly emerge. We still need reminders, and there's still going to be some significant pitfalls on the way, and that this is a warning that those things are going to happen, and so you need to strengthen yourself to be able to deal with that. All right, so thank you very much, Susan. Okay, E. Seidlin, I think you were going to say something. I don't know if you wanted to unmute yourself. Nope. Okay. Abby. Hi, Abby.
Hi. What I sort of focused on this was how he was writing all the letters perfectly, because in the future, laws will be based on this. So it's important to do things right. And so I feel like whatever job we have is to do it right, because, things, things can happen from the way you do your own job. I know I'm a neuropsychologist now, and, I was a dentist before. If you do something not so great, there can be consequences. So just, you do it the best you can, you do it as perfectly as you can. And what is the reward? The reward is you did it right. not necessarily you get something, you know, yes, you get maybe paid for it or whatever, but really the reward is that you did a good job. So that's what I got out of it.
Great. Thank you, Abby. We have an anonymous question that was about, seems like this is a case for Reform Judaism. We are an evolving religion. This is built into our foundation. So yes, I think that this is an example of, this is also trying to teach us that we have the capability of building on previous generations with the way in which we interpret Torah and how we understand Judaism, and that this gives permission that the people of the past are maybe not going to understand the Judaism the way it looks now, and the future Jews may not, we wouldn't recognize them and they may not recognize us in the future, and that there is an ever evolving, adapting quality to our tradition that is beautiful, and that maybe when God is sitting there writing those crowns on, that it's not just that the letters themselves are set in stone and that's it, that those are their articulation, the artistic articulation of change and adaptation and creative, the creative forces that can come when we create our own understanding of Torah. That, the last mitzvah of the 613 is in this week's Torah portion. It's a double Torah portion this week, but in Vayelech, the second one, we have the final 613th mitzvah, which is basically comes from a verse that suggests that each of us should write our own Torah. And so I will talk about this on Saturday morning at Shabbat services, but online. But this is also kind of built in, that we each have the opportunity to write our own Torah, and it's not just the Torah the 5 books, but it's a much grander understanding of what Torah represents. So great, thank you very much. Any other thoughts or questions at this point? No? Okay. Well, thank you, everyone. An early Shabbat Shalom. We will be back next week, right before the high holidays. And again, feel free to email me if you have any ideas for future types of learning sessions, since, as I mentioned in the beginning, the Talmud study and pretty much all the offerings that we've been doing here at Wilshire Boulevard Temple for adult education are going to be shifting for the fall. So similar as Torah always transitions and moves from one stage to the other, we don't want you all to get bored, and we want to keep it fresh, and there's so much that we all need to be learning and studying. So that's going to be coming soon. So you'll learn more information about that as we figure that out. So thank you all very much, and early Shabbat Shalom, and I hope you can find time in this coming week to prepare for the high holidays. I remind you that Slichot is happening this Saturday night. We have some study sessions starting at 6:30. I'm teaching at 7:30. I'm actually teaching one of the stories that we've studied a long time ago about the ugly man. So you can either study with me again, or you can go and learn from incredible rabbis from 4 different synagogues. And then at 8:30, we will be screening on our website and on Facebook the Slichot service, which is really beautiful. Cantor Lisa Picot put a ton of work into putting it all together, and it's really going to be beautiful. So I urge you to use that as a kickoff to the high holidays. All right, thank you all very much, and have a good rest of the week. Thank you. Bye.